Welcome to everyone who's here already. We will go ahead and give everyone a few minutes. We'll be starting at 12:05 to give everyone time to log on. Welcome to everyone who has joined up to this point. We are going to keep giving everyone a little bit more time to join, and we'll start at 12:05.
Thanks, Cody.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to attend the kickoff in this webinar series, Aqua PV, Industry Guidance for Floating PV Deployment for U.S. Reservoirs. Today we will hear from INL Clean Energy researcher Juan Gallego-Calderon and NREL Senior Legal and Regulatory Analyst Aaron Levine. They're going to cover the current state of Aqua PV and where it may be headed. During the webinar, we'll ask a couple of interactive questions using the Slido link provided in the chat. I'll provide that here in just a second. And near the close of the webinar, I'll also be providing a link in the chat to a Qualtrics form to collect feedback that you have. If you have a moment, we'd love to hear from you via that form. As a reminder, please ensure you are muted unless you've been called on. Mics are enabled to allow for discussion where appropriate. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Juan.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone for taking the time today to join us for this, the first session on the webinar series. Today, I'm just gonna give you a project overview of our floating PV project, Aqua PV, and a demo of our Aqua PV tool. Like Katie said, my name is Juan Gallego-Calderon, and I'm a clean energy researcher at Idaho National Laboratory, and I'm joined by Aaron Levine, who's my colleague from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Before we get started, I wanted just to acknowledge all the project team. This has been a multi-partner effort. So on the National Lab side, we have INL and NREL. We are very thankful for the funding from the Solar Energy Technology Office and the Water Technology Office as well, which is very cool. This is one of the few projects I'm aware of where two offices are jointly funding an effort. And then as far as project partners, we have Oregon State University, who did the environmental modeling. Then we have Noria Energy and DMV, who helped us with the CapEx tool and the techno-economic assessment. And then we have two utility partners, Cat Creek Energy and Eagle Creek Energy. So before we get into the meat of the webinar, I would like to ask you to go into the Slido link and just let us know what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about floating solar development. You know, I can give a minute or so for folks to reply, and then we can go from there. Cool. Oh, interesting. Not all aqua solar is floating. Yeah, nice. See, the opportunity is winning, so we have some optimists in the crowd, which is great. Hybridization, I see that coming up a bit. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And we have something related to water quality, which is a very fair concern. Use conflicts, okay. Finance access. Cool, well, I think we can move on. Thank you for those who, we had 17 answers. Thank you for those who replied. Some of those topics that were brought up in that word cloud will be covered today. But here's just a brief agenda. I'm gonna start with a project overview. Then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Aaron, that is going to talk about the floating PV technical potential and the regulatory pathways. I will give a brief introduction of a techno-economic assessment we did early this year, a little bit about the work in progress, and then I will jump into the demo of the tool. So first, the scope of the project. We want to provide this foundational data and analysis to stakeholders. That includes policymakers, developers, or utilities, NGOs, or financial firms seeking to understand floating PV viability in the U.S. reservoirs. So we have these four areas of work that we tackled during the past 3 years. First, we have the resource assessment. So we did a technical potential assessment on these U.S. reservoirs to determine what's possible here in the United States. Then we have the regulatory pathways, where our colleagues at NREL did surveys of these federal owners and stakeholders to see in what ways we can deploy solar PV on the U.S. federally regulated reservoirs. Then we have a techno-economic assessment tool where we can determine the capital expenditures and the financial outlook of a potential project. And then an environmental modeling effort helped us kind of like determine what could be the impacts of a solar deployment in some of these reservoirs. And all of this is packaged in the tool Aqua PV, along with some publications that I will show in a second. So who is this tool for? We have identified 5 major stakeholders. So we have solar energy developers who can use the tool to identify which reservoirs are a good candidate for their projects and maybe do a first pass pre-feasibility economic assessment. For hydropower developers, similarly, they can see, hey, do we have options for this additional generation and how much could it cost? For NGOs, they can look into potential impacts or benefits for the community or the environment of an FPV development. And then we have utilities and hydropower operators that are kind of similar used to those hydropower developers, like what opportunities are for deployment of FPV. And the asset owners can also identify potential opportunities in these federal assets. Now for the products overview, Aaron's going to talk about the technical potential and the regulatory and environmental report, and then I will jump in with the techno-economic assessment. Aaron, take it away.
Thanks, Juan. Yeah, so on the NREL side of this project, we used our geospatial team to develop a GIS-based resource assessment. I will caveat that this is a technical resource potential, so we did not do any analysis on the economic feasibility of this potential conflict with existing operations, environmental impacts, etc. So this was predominantly the result of looking at a number of criteria, including water depth, temperature to avoid areas of the country that have significant freezing in their waterways, and you can see that up in North Dakota, Minnesota. You don't see any projects deployed on this map because of that, along with taking into consideration things like navigable waterways, distance from existing infrastructure to the extent that we could identify that infrastructure within dam reservoirs. And the results of this, looking at a couple different scenarios based off of the bottom slope of the reservoir and the minimum water fill in the pool, resulted somewhere between 861 gigawatts DC and 1,042 gigawatts DC. So at the technical potential level, you can see that there's approximately a gigawatt of potential across these scenarios. You can see on this map as it's distributed that there's a lot of this potential in Texas, California, other areas of the Southeast, especially at large scale. You can see that there's some significantly pretty large reservoirs here. And if you look at this little key here, you can see the capacity of some of these reservoirs is very high. It's into the gigawatt level. Next slide, Juan. So as the project as a whole has really taken into account three types of installations that I've termed federally controlled reservoirs. And so those are the reservoirs that are either owned and operated by the Bureau of Reclamation for both federal hydropower development, non-federal hydropower development, as well as just water conveyance as the main mission of reclamation. Similarly with the Army Corps of Engineers, they have both federal hydropower and non-federal hydropower that is licensed by FERC, as well as a lot of non-powered dams that serve various purposes from irrigation to flood control to recreation throughout their system. And then finally, we looked at FERC licensed projects. And so these are non-federal licensed hydropower projects. And we looked at what is the process for adding floating solar within that existing license boundary, whether or not is actually used in conjunction with the project. As part of this, we analyzed environmental and energy benefits, and these were based off of a desktop review and some semi-structured interviews we conducted with NGOs, federal and state resource agencies, and some members of the development community. Similarly, we also analyzed environmental and other potential impacts that might restrict the deployment of floating solar at these reservoirs. And then finally, we conducted a detailed analysis of the regulatory process for approving floating solar sited at U.S. federally controlled reservoirs. I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat a link to the report. There will also be a QR code on a couple slides here. So whatever works best for you, you'll have access to this NREL report. There's a much more in-depth discussion of this, and as we'll talk about later in the presentation, we will be holding a follow-on webinar that will focus more on this work. Next slide. So at a high level here, I tried to capture some of the key potential benefits and potential impacts associated with deployment of FPV at these reservoirs. I will, flag that we have a number more of these within the report itself. So these are not supposed to be comprehensive or exhaustive by any means. And even within the report, we identified that we might not have been able to identify every potential benefit and impact associated with these projects. But some key benefits that we identified were, less land requirements than ground-mounted systems, which can reduce the need to clear, excavate, and grade land for site preparation. Certainly, there'd still be, potentially some need for that to access the site potentially, or for transmission infrastructure, but a lot of savings there from the perspective that you're not ground mounting solar. Another one that's come up both in peer-reviewed literature that we've cited to, as well as a number of our interviews, were the potential to reduce evaporative loss on water bodies. This can serve multiple purposes, including protecting species habitat, provide recreational benefits for angling and boating activities, as well as conserve water for irrigation, fire suppression, other activities that we see on these reservoirs. We also see reduced environmental impacts by using existing infrastructure and grid connections. So particularly when we're looking at the hybridized hydropower and floating solar projects, you can identify a need for less new infrastructure to be developed using existing transmission lines and substations particularly. And for a full list of those benefits, again, read the report. On the potential impact side, one of the key concerns from both federal and state environmental regulators has been reflective PV modules causing avian species to mistake the FPV modules for bodies of water. So similar to the lake effect that we see with ground-mounted systems, but maybe a heightened concern since these are floating on water, which can create even more confusion of what is the water body and what is the solar panels. And these can ultimately result in stranding, injuries, and mortality to avian species. We also see potential changes in nutrient level concentrations, including dissolved oxygen and dissolved carbon levels These can certainly impact species and other elements of water quality. The addition of FPV systems may also create new perching habitats for predatory bird species. So thinking of raptors and other species that can then get an unfair advantage over their prey, to where they can leverage the floating solar infrastructure to perch and then increase the mortality rate of either other avian species or aquatic species that they may prey on. And then finally, a big one that I wanted to cover is, certainly we heard this from a number of stakeholders, that floating solar could affect reservoir aesthetics, existing recreation, including boating and angling, and or reservoir operations. And so this is something that the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers, I think, expressed concern with, that not all reservoirs might be conducive to floating solar that they operate because of those existing reservoir operations. This may be the result of large fluctuations in the pool. There might be other considerations in terms of how the reservoir is operated that is not conducive to having floating solar panels. And so while this is not something that extends to all reservoirs, it's certainly a consideration that needs to be taken into account at the reservoir level itself. And again, for more health, safety, and environmental impacts, see the full report. Next slide. So just at a very high level, I wanted to touch on some of the considerations on the regulatory framework, including these processes, as well as the other agencies under federal law that may be involved in addition to those that have the primary role of overseeing the reservoir. So things such as water quality, Endangered Species Act compliance, historic preservation, etc. It's all covered in the report. But at the highest level, I wanted to flag that FERC has the authority over the construction, operation, and maintenance of floating solar PV developed within a FERC licensed hydroelectric or PSH project. And this can happen in either two ways. It can be determined to be a miscellaneous structure used and useful in connection with the hydroelectric project, which is more maybe of a true hybridized format in which maybe parts of the solar installation are actually, say, feeding a control center within the project, or working hand in hand with the hydropower. And that analysis will look slightly different compared to if it's the other potential pathway, which is just the floating solar is sited within the jurisdictional boundary. So the FERC license boundary utilizing project lands and waters, and so this can be approved as a non-project use of those lands and waters. This really comes into play with amendment process on whether it's a non-capacity amendment or a non-capacity amendment for non-project use, as covered in the report. The second agency we looked at, Bureau of Reclamation. Reclamation has the authority over these projects, whether they're standalone or co-located with hydropower or PSH. If it's sited at a reclamation reservoir and it's subject to reclamation jurisdiction. And by that, I mean reservoirs from which FERC licensing jurisdiction has been withdrawn. So as some of you may be aware, there are some reservoirs where FERC still is the regulating party that would issue a license. There are many others that go through Reclamation's lease of power privilege process. And then for the floating solar specifically, it would be a non-hydropower renewable energy use authorization that would be issued by Reclamation. And then finally, with the Army Corps of Engineers, they have the authority over these projects sited at USACE reservoirs. If it's a non-powered reservoir, it would simply go through an Army Corps approval process, predominantly looking at the 408 process and how that installation would impact potentially safety or integrity of that existing core dam. However, as many of you also may know, a number of Army Corps projects that have hydropower have non-federal hydropower development. And by that, I mean private development or development by municipal entities that are not federal, like Reclamation and Army Corps. And so those projects require a FERC license as well as the Army Corps authorization. And so within those projects, you would see both agencies issuing approvals for the addition of the floating solar. Next slide. And so again, here is the QR code to download the report, if that's easier for some of you. But three big takeaways on this work that I wanted to flag. So, while we've certainly seen promising technical potential, again, in the terawatt range of capacity, we do understand that there's environmental, health, and safety impacts, as well as regulatory processes and timelines that may impact real-world deployment. And so we don't anticipate seeing that level of deployment. We understand that there's species and recreation and other considerations that'll come into play. We also found that we think there's more research needed into both environmental benefits and the environmental health and safety impacts. While there's a growing body of literature in this space, particularly in areas outside of the United States, we haven't seen enough data yet, I think, to satisfy a lot of U.S. regulators in terms of the type of information that they're going to be looking for. And so whether these studies are completed specifically for individual projects or are broader than that, we feel that more of that is needed. But ultimately, despite these uncertainties, we do feel that FPV is a viable alternative to ground-mounted PV under certain conditions where ground-mounted solar may not be feasible due to either land availability and other land uses or land acquisition costs if it's a very expensive part of the United States with limited open land. And so ultimately, we feel that the future of this technology is bright. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Juan to go over some of the techno-economic analysis and give us a demo of our AquaPV tool.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so just briefly, I want to show some results we got earlier this year and they were detailed in this paper we presented on an IEEE conference, where we took like a pilot 1 megawatt design, and we did a TEA, techno-economic analysis, on different electricity markets. So you can see on the screen that we looked at CAISO, Duke, ERCOT, and PJM. In addition to this, we implemented some probabilistic forecasting for the electricity price. That way we can have uncertainty associated with that price for the life of the project. So that was one of the inputs that we used, in addition to the capital and operational costs that our tool provides. There were three big takeaways. One, that as of this year, with the numbers that we used, CAISO seems the most favorable market for FPV, thanks to its abundant solar resource, but also higher prices. And then we also applied the investment tax credit and production tax credit, so we could compare which one could be more beneficial for a FPV project. And we found, as you can see in the bottom plot, that the PTC tends to have a shorter payback period for the 4 cases. Then lastly, when you compare these numbers with land-based solar, we found that they were about 16% on average higher, which means that there is still some work to be done to reduce some of those prices to develop this type of projects. Again, these were hypothetical, so because we don't have, at least to our knowledge, projects participating in these markets to verify it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about work in progress very quickly before jumping into the tool. So I mentioned at the beginning that we're very interested in the hybrid plant component. So that's why we're looking at hydropower sites with floating PV. So we're working on a paper on the hydro FPV battery dispatch optimization, just to see how can we benefit operators with this co-generation using solar and hydropower. As of now, we've been testing the typical objective, which is to maximize the revenue and we haven't found much of a difference with the sizes of battery, but of course we're testing different battery sizes compared to the capacity of the FPV and the hydropower. Things that we're interested in is to look into other objectives, such as how can we stabilize a bit the generation, so FPV becomes more like an aid to provide hydropower flexibility. So that's kind of what we're working right now. And then we will have a webinar on this in November. I have the date at the end of this session. Before jumping into the demo, I would just want to take a quick poll on what folks feel like it is the greatest opportunity, or the most exciting opportunity, sorry, for floating solar right now. Yeah, we can take a minute or so to get the responses. Again, I think the link is on the chat, or you can type this code if you go to slido.com. Actually, we it's not included here, but on the data set that we're going to publish about the technical potential, we're including what are the evaporation savings that you can achieve with this for a given year of weather. So we did look into that. Use. Yeah, this response in Oregon is interesting because that's kind of most of the development that we've seen in the United States is in this type of, not necessarily just irrigation regulation reservoirs, but I guess when you mean known light water bodies, kind of man-made. So I know that, for example, Disney World has a few in all of the ponds that they have in Orlando, or on some water treatment facilities they also exist. Port electrification, interesting. This project doesn't address offshore, as in the ocean floating PV, but it's certainly interesting as well. Okay, since we are all in the Slido thing, I'm gonna move on to the next and the last interactive question, and is, what is your greatest concern about floating solar development? I'm gonna give a minute or so. Okay. Wave perceptions. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. I'm just gonna move on since we're getting close to or past half an hour. Yeah, I'm gonna get out of the slides and I'm just gonna give the Aqua PV demo. It's gonna be sort of like the basic workflow that you would use if you were coming like without a reservoir in mind or you're just curious. So we can touch on all of the features of the tool. So let me switch to my other window. Okay, so when you come to the home page of Aqua PV, this is what you will see. It tells you what the Aqua PV toolkit is. It lists all of the tools that we have, so techno-economic analysis, CapEx estimation, solar generation, floating solar potential, and environmental impact. You can also access them from the tabs on the top. We also have a resource page that will have the papers, data sets, etc., and a frequently asked questions. So let's say I'm interested in finding a reservoir. So I can go here into FPV capacity. Here at the top, we listed all the assumptions or that we're taking for the analysis, and I'm not gonna go through them because Aaron mentioned them in his presentation. And then here we have the map of all of the reservoirs that we consider. The colors right now indicate whether they are FERC, Army Corps, or a FERC and Army Corps reservoir in a bureau. And then you can choose to show by capacity size. So for example, we see here the Salton Sea is one of the ones with the largest capacity, up to 76 gigawatts. And then you can also display by the area of the reservoir, the developable area within the reservoir, how many kilometers square of FPV are technically potential, and then the percentage, which is also kind of a nice measurement. So that's basically this developable area over the area of the reservoir, and then the depth. Let's say I want to look into this ABQ Lake, which is located in New Mexico. And here we have the data just displayed here on the right that is telling me that you can develop up to 82 megawatts of DC capacity, and the developable area will be about 19.5% of the total reservoir area. Before moving on to the next step, I just want you to know that at the bottom we have some of those statistics that Aaron presented, but here are for each of those 5 categories and for each owner. So we can see that in terms of capacity, the Army Corps reservoirs have the largest potential among the other designations. So, okay, let's say I chose my lake, my reservoir, the ABQ Lake, and the next step I would like to do is that I want to see how much can I generate on a typical year. So then you can go into the solar generation tool. Here are some of the assumptions in the back end. We're using PVLib to generate the time series. So if I want to go to the ABQ reservoir, I can type the zip code, and then it said that it was up to 82 megawatts or something like that, but I know that because there is a FERC license there is a hydropower plant, and I just looked it up and I found that it was about 15.6 megawatts. So having an existing plant at 15.6 megawatts versus an 82 seems a little bit too much. So I want to be conservative, and I'm just going to choose, let's start with a 5 megawatt DC system. And then you can also change its total efficiency if you want, or the DC to AC ratio. But the tool will just display the results. either the instantaneous generation or like the monthly energy as well. You can download the results as well, which will come in a format that is ready to be used in the techno-economic assessment. So now we know the reservoirs that we want to use. We know what's the capacity. So now we need to know how much is that going to cost us. So we can go into the CapEx estimation tool, which this was, we spent quite a bit of time, and I do want to acknowledge Noria Energy for providing some of the real project information to generate this. So this is based on real projects in the United States right now. And the challenge with this is that we wanted to have a tool that is not an engineering design tool, so it doesn't require a bunch of inputs. So this way, I think we can reach more audiences. And like I said, you can, regardless of the stakeholder, because we're targeting solar developers as well as hydropower developers or hydropower operators. So then we felt like this was a more friendly tool to start with. So that's why the input parameters are pretty basic. So we have the project size, again, the conversion ratio, some considerations about the panels like tilt, or what's the size of the solar panel, solar and inverter cost, what is going to be the distance to shore. This kind of dictates our mooring cost, cell stacks, and whether you require a new substation. And the reason we included this is because since we are very interested on hybridization with existing hydropower plants, in some cases, there is the substation that exists in the plant might have enough capacity to take a new generation. So, but if you don't, then you can just choose, oh yeah, I need a new substation, and then you can see how the prices increase. So with a new substation, this project would cost about $7.5 million, whereas without the new substation, it comes down to 7.1. So we can choose, whatever we want from this. So we can know this number. You can also download the results, and they come in the table with all of these categories. We also have these two main categories, hard and soft costs. We're trying to be consistent with some of CETO's language and in the industry, so we can have a discrimination between where the costs are more sensitive. The total cost of the project is more sensitive to. And then at the bottom, we have a description of each of these categories. So I will invite you to go and take a look and let us know what you think. I'm not going to go through them just because I want to be sensitive of time. So now that I know what is the total cost of the project, I can come into the techno-economic analysis tool. So in here, to do a TEA, we need two main inputs. We need the costs, we need generation. Sorry, we need three, and then how much can we sell this for? So I can find the solar generation I had downloaded before, and then the tool automatically, based on the generation, tries to estimate what's the CapEx and the OpEx, and then it puts them into the step 3 that you see at the bottom. But I saw before in the CapEx tool that it was actually about 7.1. So this was meant so you don't have to run the CapEx. You can just go with this. So again, we're trying to make it very easy for people to use it. But now that I did run the CapEx, I can change it later on. So I'm just gonna close this. Then I have a price data hourly for the area. And then I do want you to know that for each of these two steps, you can download an example file. So you can put in your own data and before uploading it to the tool. That way, because we need to be consistent with the template. So we do provide that. We provide that. And then lastly, we have these other project parameters. So first we have here the CapEx. I'm just gonna change it by the 7.478 million that it was the cost with a new substation. And then you can change, you can provide some high and low percentages from the estimate. So you can have a range on the results of the TEA. So the default is 5%. We also have an OPEX estimate per year. And then we do have the incentives as well. So based on your situation, you can change these numbers for the investment tax credit or the production tax credit. You can also see the table here. This comes from the Department of Energy, and we provide the link for the original version. Life expectancy, the default is 30 years, and then we have an annual discount rate of 4%. So once you input all of that, you can click calculate TEA, and the tool is just gonna calculate the results. The first plot that you see is just the solar generation and the price sort of merged and put in, synchronized and put into a 30-year time series. Then we have a visualization of the revenue, the cost, and the payback period for the life of the project. And then at the bottom, you can see all these TEA metrics for the combinations between low, baseline, and high of the costs. So, for example, on the lowest CapEx, so the 7.5 minus the 5%, and the OPEX, the lowest OPEX, for an ITC, the payback period could be 10.3 million. Sorry, 10.3 years. For the PTC will be 10.6. And then if you don't apply incentives, then it will be close to 15 years. And then similarly, you can take a look for the LCOE. As you can see, like the incentives can really, really help these projects be more affordable. And then we have, values for NPV, for the net present value, return on investment, and internal rate of return. Lastly, I want to talk about the environmental impact tab. So this one's also kind of challenging because a proper environmental assessment requires site-specific data for many months at least, and that's very difficult to do. And also, there is no reservoir, like this type of reservoirs that have a floating solar that we could have collected data for. So these are just a modeling effort. And I do want to acknowledge my colleagues, Evan Bradway and Sarah Hinkle and Ivan Arizmendi from Oregon State University, who came up with this methodology to use existing reservoir models to try to estimate what could be the impact. So they took this very state-of-the-art, accepted in the literature, SQL W2 models for 11 of the reservoirs. So you can see here the map of the reservoirs. The red bubbles are those reservoirs for which we have a model, and then the blue ones are the rest. So the idea was that we could use the existing reservoirs as a proxy for others, depending on some reservoir characteristics, for example, area and depth. So again, our example of the Abiquiu Lake has an area of 4.2 square kilometers and a depth of almost 15 meters. And the closest model reservoir by this principal component analysis method that they use is this Lake Milton, Ohio. So the results that you're about to see are based on that reservoir. Next, what they did is that you can cover the reservoir, the surface of the reservoir. And this is right now, we're just showing the percentage covered, and then get the relative change to certain metrics. So the default shows the temperature. So the mean surface temperature and all of them come into two seasons, so winter and summer. And if we go back to looking at what the technical potential tells us, that that reservoir could be covered up to 20%. Here, the environmental impact shows us that in the winter, that means that the mean surface temperature will be reduced by 11% from what it was from baseline. And then in the summer, it will reduce about 4.2%. Something that we have kind of like heard from talking to stakeholders in hydropower, or the dissolved oxygen is actually part of the licenses. So this can show what is the impact on dissolved oxygen. In some cases, it's good because it actually increases. So in reservoirs where they're being affected by climate change, when the water that is coming in the spring is too hot, the dissolved oxygen can be lowered, and that can be impact the hydropower operations because the fish downstream are being impacted as well. So in this case, it actually increases the dissolved oxygen. So again, big disclaimer, these are models. It's just kind of like a way to give an idea and start the conversation about how can we address these potential issues, but also celebrate the benefits that floating PV can have in these reservoirs. Before I go back to the slides, I just want to show the resource page has, we're going to start listing all our publications. Right now we have the techno-economic assessment, the environmental and regulatory considerations. We talked about this today. We are also waiting for this to be published. This is those impacts on the evaporation. So it's just we don't have a link yet, but that's something that we included in the calculations. Lastly, we do have a frequently asked questions. These were collected from some industry feedback we got. So I just want to invite you to go and play with the tool and reach out if you have questions about our methods, if it's not clear in there, or if you have other ideas. We really want your feedback. You can just, if you click in project, it will basically give you my email, and then I will be the one reading those. Okay, I am going to stop sharing that, and then I'm going to go back to the slides just to wrap it up. Yeah, so in terms of the outlook for the project, for the technical work, that CapEx tool that you saw was just for like a normal reservoir, but we are working on a pump storage hydro version because there are some additional considerations like the reservoir level variation, the land distance to the substation, and the type of mooring and anchoring that is needed to be able to operate in those conditions. We're also doing some work with complementary on the resource of hydropower and PV. It's kind of a spin-off of that dispatch optimization, but it's more trying to identify some high-value reservoirs, not just by capacity, but by other dimensions, like flexibility to hydropower, for example, or community benefits, etc. And then again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we're really looking forward to people to use the tool and to give us feedback so we can incorporate it in next versions. We're like trying to update it maybe on a bi-weekly basis as we find either bugs or we get feedback from stakeholders. And then just to end the presentation, I just want to pitch these two other sessions that we want to do on the webinar series. One, we're going to present the final results on the dispatch optimization work on November 6th at noon Mountain Time. And then Aaron is going to give a deep dive into the technical resource assessment methodology and the regulatory and environmental pathways report on December 5th at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. And with that, this is the end of the webinar. I don't know if we have any questions in the chat or. Okay. Yeah. Hey, Jed, thanks. Yes, that is correct. It's like if you need a new substation, that's when you click the yes for the CapEx tool, basically. And then for Tom Lang, so for estimating the solar resource, we are using PVLib. That's the Python open source tool, and then their link is in the solar generation assumptions list. Thanks, Jason. Good to see that you made it today. Yeah, like I said, please reach out. I will type my email here. Maybe Aaron, you can do the same. And yeah, just please reach out with any questions. Aaron, you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna. I can highlight for the group. Jason was asking how other parts of the world have dealt with some of these identified environmental impacts. Our research on this was limited to those impacts that have been identified in peer-reviewed and gray literature. We didn't actually look at any sort of regulatory documents and identifying mitigation measures aimed at reducing some of these impacts. Certainly something that would be good for future work. I'll also add that, I've done a lot of this comparative analysis in other spaces in the past. Sometimes it's challenging if other countries don't have similar resource protection laws that we have in place here. And so sometimes there's challenges that might not exist in places in Africa or Southeast Asia that do exist in the US, just based off our legal and regulatory structure and how we review and protect the environment on the front end of a project. And then Juan, I don't know if you or someone on the INL team could answer this question from Tom Lang on what you're using to estimate the SPR, whether it was.
I did. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, okay. It was the PVLib one. When I mentioned that we were using PVLib.
And I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat.
Oh, there was, okay, I see one from Stacy Peterson. What about co-locating with aquaculture? Initially, so I didn't mention it here, but we had like 3 case studies. So like a normal reservoir, the pump storage hydro, and estuaries actually. And we were exploring doing a case study with a oyster farm in Oregon, but then like a lot of people mentioned, the operations and maintenance was kind of a concern, and there's not like clear guidelines about what to do with like water electricity nexus. Like sometimes you have to put the inverters on the floating and the water and so on. And there was the industry partners raised the concern that actually having a co-located, other thing co-located to it that requires human interaction close to the panels outside of normal maintenance could be potentially dangerous, and it's kind of like a red flag for permitting and safety issues. So we didn't really, then we kind of like put it aside because it was kind of way too outside of the scope of the project. So in relation to aquaculture, we didn't really do a deep dive. So for the cooling, we use weather data to determine the model uses the water temperature and the air temperature. So that's what we were doing, just to answer Tom Lang's questions. Okay, we're on top of the hour. Can we join the project by floating PV structure company? Scotra, Captain Sun. You know, the project is ending at the end of the year. However, we always look for feedback and partners. So please send me an email. We can set up a call and talk about ways that you can either benefit or help us, please. Tom, I would like to talk to you a bit more about that. Would you mind sending me an email? Oh, I can see your email here. I can reach out so we can talk a little bit more about that. Okay, just because we are past the hour, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we can talk soon. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.